Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my early round draft strategies for the 2022 fantasy football season. Of course, on today's episode, I want to impart some knowledge upon you guys and give you guys some context in regards to how I personally navigate the early rounds of my respective drafts. We talked about the concept yesterday on my top 12 running back rankings video, and I wanted to go ahead and advance that in terms of giving you more information, more statistics that justify the reasoning as to how I navigate my early rounds, what positions I'm particularly going after, in the statistics and the history of fantasy football that justifies my decision making. Now, of course, before we get into that, I want to thank you guys for the incredible support from yesterday's video. You guys coming out, of course, down in the comment section, sending your support in my direction. Of course, clicking the like button down below. That all helps the channel grow and continues to let me make content for you guys on a daily basis in terms of fantasy football. So thank you again. Like I mentioned, we're going to be making daily fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. So for those of you who are trying to get an upper hand on your league mates and, of course, help yourself win a 2022 fantasy football championship, be sure to subscribe down below. Thank you very much. Now, another way to potentially grant yourself an advantage is to take the information that I'm about to present to you guys throughout this video and apply it in an upcoming draft. And where can you potentially do that? Well, you can do it via Underdog Fantasy. There's a multitude of best ball drafts happening today, whether it's Best Ball Mania 3, the Puppy 3, that you can go in and enter today and take these early round draft strategies and potentially put it to use. See what kind of rosters you can build. Whether you use my exact strategies or potentially modify them and build your own, it doesn't really matter. As long as you're refining your craft of drafting this offseason and continuing to gain confidence and experience, regardless, you're going to be far more prepared when it comes to drafting in your home leagues when you have those difficult decisions to be made. So again, check out Underdog Fantasy. There's a link down in the description today. If you click on that link or use promo code Andrew today, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. Again, whether it's Best Ball Mania 3, the Puppy 3, Pomeranians, I'm sure are down the road. There's a lot of fun to be had via Underdog Fantasy, so be sure to check that out today. Use promo code Andrew. Thank you very much. All right, let's go ahead and transition to my early round draft strategy conversation. And before I begin, I want to, of course, preface that regardless of what I present today, there isn't a singular strategy that is always going to find success in fantasy football. That is literally impossible. There are far too many variables in fantasy football, whether it be your draft, injuries, whether it's waiver wire, whether it's trading, that are going to impact the success of your given season. So one singular strategy isn't always going to get you into the championship game. Now, yes, I have gone ahead and I've refined the strategy that I'm going to present today over the last 10 years. And I've continued to build upon it and found what exactly works and what doesn't. And I'm going to present that to you today. But I want to go ahead and, of course, let it be known, you can find success with any draft strategy you'd like. You can use mine. You can not use mine. You can take the information I present to you today, modify it, refine your own strategy, and find success like that. So let that be known first and foremost. With that mentioned, let's go ahead and let's talk about positional distribution. You may be wondering, Andrew, what exactly is that referring to? Now, when you go into a draft, regardless of whether you're the first pick or the 12th pick, regardless of scoring format, you have one singular job in that first round. When you begin a draft, you need to ensure that your first overall selection is going to be a player that ranks amongst the top 12 at the end of that given season. If you are not drafting a running back, wide receiver, or a tight end that finishes as a top 12 flex player, then you have made a mistake and you have already failed your first round. Now, there are variables in fantasy football that, of course, can derail that overall success. For example, injuries like we saw for majority of the early round picks last year. Christian McCaffrey, we saw Derrick Henry go down with an injury, Dalvin Cook. A lot of those things can derail that success. But that's what we're looking for. That is the goal. We want to draft a player that is going to be within the top 12 flex of the given season of 2022. Now, in order to go ahead and present more information, I've gone ahead and collected the top 12 flex players over the last 5 years in a half PPR scoring format. As you can see, we have seen 33 running backs, 25 wide receivers, and 2 tight ends finish within the top 12 over the last 5 seasons. Now, in the last 2 seasons alone, we see that there's a little bit of a pattern building in comparison to years past, where we've seen a high distribution of running backs finishing within the top 12 flex players overall in a half PPR scoring format. As of late, it has been extremely balanced, with 1 tight end each of the last 2 years and 11 running backs and 11 wide receivers. So overall, this positional distribution is at an equal rate, which should give us more confidence in terms of drafting wide receivers early, shouldn't it? With that being said, when we go ahead and look at current ADPs via Underdog Fantasy, the current positional distribution consists of 6 running backs, 5 wide receivers, and 1 tight end, typically Travis Kelce. Now, this got me thinking, well, if you're going to approach a draft, how certain are we that the player that we're going to select is going to go from being an RB1 from last year to being an RB1 in 2022? So I've gone ahead and found those statistics. Over the last 5 seasons, we have seen back-to-back RB1s just 47% of the time. That return rate isn't great overall, but in the last 5 seasons, with a potential of 60 total RB1s, we've only seen 28 running backs have back-to-back seasons of being an RB1. 47% return rate, it's not great, but we'll take it. In comparison to the wide receiver position, in terms of going from a wide receiver 1 in 1 year, and following that with another wide receiver 1 performance, we've seen 25 wide receivers over the last 5 seasons, which is a 42% return rate. Relatively close between 2 positions, giving us even more confidence that drafting a wide receiver early can have a lot of value. Now, the other stat that I wanted to present to the right of that is first-time RB1s and first-time wide receiver 1s. Every year, there is a random amount of players that out of nowhere find success and for the first time in their respective careers become top 12 in their given position. Over the last 5 seasons, we've seen 22 running backs and 23 wide receivers find that kind of success, which is a 37 and a 38% success rate. Last season, we saw Cordero Patterson come out of nowhere for the running back position. We saw Hunter Renfrow come out of nowhere for the wide receiver position. So it's always possible to find players that come out of nowhere and will find success. Now, despite all that information that I've presented, I still prefer predominantly to draft early running backs. And you may be wondering, well, Angie, you've made a case for potentially going wide receiver early. Why are you now saying that you want to go early on running backs? Well, it has to do with the dead zone running backs. Now, you may be wondering, Andrew, what is the concept of a dead zone running back? What is the RB dead zone? Well, it is a fixture of time between a certain amount of rounds in your respective draft in which the running back position are often landmines rather than players that you're going to draft and pay off in terms of their ADP and the draft capital you spent on them. For example, some people may define the dead zone of RBs from rounds 3 through 7. I personally define the dead zone of running backs between rounds 4 through 7/8. It really does depend on how many running backs come off the board early and what tier of running back is potentially in that 3rd/4th round, which begins the RB dead zone. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, okay, Andrew, if there's such thing as an RB dead zone, prove it to us. Perfectly fine. Let's do that. Last season in 2021, there were so many unsuccessful running backs that cost a lot of, draft capital, and they certainly didn't return on said capital because they didn't have performances, found themselves injured, or just found themselves losing their respective jobs. Let's talk about some of these players. There were 13 running backs, starting with James Robinson, Chris Carson, Gus Edwards, Miles Sanders, Myles Gaskin, Michael Carter, Ronald Jones, Darrell Henderson, Mike Davis, Kareem Hunt, Trey Sermon, Raheem Mostert, and Chase Edmonds. 13 running backs that were selected between rounds 4 through 7/8 that found no success and rarely returned on the draft capital that was used for them during a draft. A lot of these guys either ended up on your waiver wire or off your roster by the end of the season because they weren't helping you, they were finding themselves injured, and that's just a common thread at the running back position. Now, throughout that span of time, rounds 4 through 7/8, there were some successful running backs. We saw guys like DeAndre Swift have a lot of success. Damian Harris was fantastic. Javonte Williams, Melvin Gordon. 4 running backs out of 17 that found themselves in a very successful position last season. The success rate isn't the greatest there, but it's not impossible. There is a chance that you can go into the RB dead zone and find yourself some success. But historically, statistically, the odds are stacked against you. So you may be wondering, Andrew, how do you go ahead and, immediately address that RB dead zone? Well, I draft 2 running backs within the first 3 rounds of almost every draft that I participate in. I don't care to start running back, but I want to ensure that 2 of my top 3 positions are going to be running back. So whether I go wide receiver RB or RB wide receiver RB, maybe throw in a tight end in that combination, whether it's in my 2nd or 3rd round, it doesn't matter. There are a multitude of ways where I can go ahead, collect 3 players in my first 3 rounds, and ensure 2 of them, minimum, are running backs. Now, in order to actualize and give you some visual representation as to where this RB dead zone exists, I'm going to go ahead and show you the next graphic, which is the drop off in production. I've shown this for the last 3+ years, and I always want to give you guys more context. And I really do think that the drop off in production is a huge statistic that we all have to look at. Over the last 5 seasons, I've gone ahead and taken the averages of players ranked 1 through 32 in fantasy football. And I've gone ahead and done this specifically so we can have an understanding as to what a typical number 1 ranked running back should present to us on a yearly basis in comparison to a wide receiver and a tight end. Now, as you can see to the right of me, the top 5 to 7 running backs in comparison to their counterparts at the tight end and wide receiver position are often dominating in terms of overall fantasy point production on average over the last 5 seasons. That's really not much of a surprise. Of course, that's why we draft so many running backs over the last couple years, and they continue to find success. But the reason why I am so committed to drafting multiple running backs within my early rounds isn't because I'm trying to not only cash in on the potential hype of grabbing one of these guys that are going to explode and have a 280+ point fantasy season, but I'm also trying to avoid the drop off in production that quickly emerges at the running back position. Now, typically in a regular underdog draft going on today, we would see 16 running backs come off the board within the first 3 rounds. That is an average based on ADPs that have been conducted over the last month. Now, in some drafts, you may see 14 running backs taken, maybe 20. It really depends, but on average, about 16 running backs taken in the first 3 rounds. After the number 16 running back over the last 5 seasons, if you look from ranks 17 through 32, there is a ridiculous drop-off in production when we compare the running back position to their counterparts at the wide receiver position. Of course, rank 17, the average running back at that point has put up 175 points over the last 5 years, while the average wide receiver at wide receiver 17 has put up 184 fantasy points. And as we progress down the list, the gap continues to lead in advantage of the wide receiver position. So once everybody is gone ahead and taken their early wide receivers, and Andrew has gone ahead and stacked up 2 running backs on his roster, the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th rounds at the wide receiver position are going to be vital. And I'm going to find far more fantasy point stability and far more potential for upside in those receivers in comparison to the dead zone running backs that I am avoiding by taking early running back selections. Now, the drop off in production for the tight end position will be addressed later on in this video because I will talk about drafting early quarterbacks and tight ends. But I just want to kind of go ahead and lay the foundation as to why that drop off in production is so important, because running backs quickly fall off, and it really makes it difficult to have to draft them between rounds 4 through 7 when you're not really sure about these players. And if in fact they have to be a starter for you every single week as an RB2, it's going to be very difficult to find consistent success with the history that we've seen at the position. Now that we've covered that, I wanted to transition to the next topic of our conversation. And yes, you may be thinking, Andrew, right, you've talked about drafting 2 running backs within your first 3 rounds. Well, which running backs should we select? Is there a specific indicator that kind of gives us an idea as to who we should be selecting and why? Well, I've always mentioned it in fantasy football, and I'll say it every single year: opportunity equals success in fantasy football. The greatest prospect of scoring more fantasy points on a weekly basis derives from seeing the ball more. If you get more touches on a weekly basis, you're going to score more points. That is not a difficult concept to understand. And we've seen that year in and year out at the running back, wide receiver, and tight end positions. So if we think about the running back position isolated, what are their 2 potential opportunities? Rushing attempts and passing targets. And there's a reason why in yesterday's video within the top 12 running backs, I put such a highlight or wanted to go ahead and talk about how many opportunities teams are giving their respective running backs, because it is oh so important to go ahead and have a high level of opportunity. Because again, opportunity equals success. With that all being said, I wanted to also go ahead and quantify the value of an opportunity. Give it a numeric value that can express how much value a running back is being given on a per down basis if they're seeing an opportunity, whether it be an attempt or a target. So as you can see on screen, over the last 5 seasons, I've gone ahead and quantified it as such. Collecting all of the rushing attempts of every single running back in the National Football League throughout those years, all the targets that they've received, the fantasy points that have been contributed because of those opportunities, and the per attempt and target fantasy point contributions of each. As you can see in 2021, each attempt at the running back position valued at 0.618 fantasy points per attempt, which is pretty decent. Obviously has gone down in comparison to seasons past, but it's pretty much at an average pace. While last season, the fantasy points per target was at 1.15. Obviously, you may look at these numbers and think to yourself, Andrew, doesn't this kind of give us an idea as to how we can predict on potential future performances if we know a player is going to be given 15 plus? Can that give us a little bit of an insight as to where they're going to produce in a given year? I would predominantly say no, because the entire point of kind of quantifying the value of an opportunity isn't to predict the future because there are so many variables. It's more in line with echoing my sentiments of opportunity leading to success, because not all opportunities are created equally. You can have an opportunity inside the 5-yard line where you're given an attempt and you walk right into the end zone, and that opportunity turns into 6.5 fantasy points. While you could have an opportunity where you take a halfback pitch out of the backfield, run 10 yards to the sideline and go down with a -3 loss in terms of yardage. There are different values of different opportunities, and they're not all created equally, which is why I don't want to go ahead and use it as a way to predict future, successes or failures of running backs. With that being said, we do find a lot of running backs find success when they are typically above the averages of both fantasy points per attempt and fantasy points per target. Specifically, some players that I wanted to mention last season, that out of the 152 running backs that were given an opportunity last year, only 19 running backs were able to have above average performances in fantasy points per attempt and target. Couple of those names: Jonathan Taylor, Austin Eckler, Joe Mixon, James Conner, Derrick Henry, Nick Chubb. A lot of these guys found a lot of success regardless of the opportunities given, but like I mentioned, not all opportunities are equal, and these guys were scoring a lot of touchdowns. Let's talk about a running back that perhaps didn't score a lot of touchdowns and was in fact less effective per opportunity than majority of running backs in the National Football League, and yet still finishes the number 4 overall back. That would be Najee Harris. That's correct. Najee Harris in 2021 had a below average fantasy point per attempt and fantasy point per target average. But the reason why he was able to finish still as the number 4 overall back is because he had a total of 401 total opportunities. That number is insane to me. In this current landscape, in this current meta of fantasy football, we can no longer rely upon running backs that are not given high volumes of opportunity. There's only been one running back in the last 10 seasons that has been able to finish as an RB1 with less than 200 total opportunities. In fact, there have only been 19 running backs in the last 10 years that have finished as an RB2 with less than 200 opportunities in a given season. So obviously, we want to draft guys that are going to be in that high range of opportunities. So let's go ahead and let's talk about, where this game has kind of gone to, the evolution of football, and why we less likely see running backs in this top tier conversation of getting 250, 280, 300 total touches in a year. Mainly has to do with the fact that the game's transitioned to a heavy passing scheme. When we look at the last 20 years of the National Football League, there is a huge decline in terms of running backs in the amount of total attempts on the ground that they have received and total touches they have received as running backs. In fact, when we look at in the past decade, running backs with 300 plus rushing attempts in a year, we've seen a 75% decline. In terms of running backs with 400 plus touches, it's a 79% decline, and 300 plus touches, it's a 42% decline. The player on screen, Derrick Henry, at this current moment in time is maybe one of the last of the dying breed of running backs that is even in contention of getting 400 touches in a given season. There aren't many left, and being able to draft a running back that is still capable and is still going to be given said opportunity in a year certainly does make a difference. But in terms of the evolution of the game of football, and specifically it affecting fantasy football, we have not seen many running backs with a high level of touches. I mean, when we look at last season's amount of running backs with 300 plus touches in comparison to the year prior, even with an extra game in 2021, the numbers are relatively similar. The game is changing. We're running the ball less, we're targeting running backs more, and that is where a lot of value is being found. So with that all mentioned, let's talk about workhorse running backs. guys that are at the top tier, guys that should be selected within the first 2 to 3 rounds of every single draft, guys that I'm going after. From 2017 through 2021, there have been 28 total running backs that have had 300 or more touches in a given year. Of those 28 running backs, 26 of them finished as top 12 running backs at the position. That's a 93% success rate. When we look at running backs that have totaled 280 touches or more in a season, there was 39 of them. 35 finished as top 12 running backs. That's a 90% success rate. When we go to 250 plus touches, obviously a wider scale of potential players, 63 running backs were able to accomplish that. But the numbers continue to decline in terms of top 12 representation. Only 43 of those 63 becoming top 12 players with a 68% success rate. Now, as we transition to more conversations and more statistics regarding workhorse running backs in terms of history over the last 5 seasons, we have seen a pretty standard number of running backs every single year average 20 plus touches per game. In fact, in the last 5 seasons, we have seen 36 running backs average 20 or more touches per game with 8 games played minimum. Those running backs on a per week average were averaging 17.76 fantasy points per game. Of those 36 running backs, 22 of them finished within the top 12 flex players. Again, those players were averaging a little bit more fantasy points per week with 19.12 fantasy points per game. 22 out of the potential 36 running backs over the last 5 years makes it a 61.11% success rate of running backs that are in that conversation becoming top 12 flex players. Now, if we continue this conversation in regards to total opportunities, with running backs averaging 20 plus opportunities per game, 33 of them have accomplished that over the last 5 seasons, 21 as top 12 flex players, averaging a high volume of fantasy points. If you even go past those primary stud players, guys like Derrick Henry, Najee Harris, Jonathan Taylor's, Alvin Kamara's, Ezekiel Elliott, if you go past those respective players that have been in those conversations over the last 5 seasons, and we just talk about players in 2021 between weeks 1 through 18 who handled 21 plus opportunities in a game or handled 20 plus touches in a game, they always find success. Whether it was Cordero Patterson, whether it was Chase Edmonds, whether it was James Conner, it could have been any running back. When you're given high levels of opportunity, you're scoring, as you can see on screen, 18 plus fantasy points in a week based on what we saw last season. Now, with all this information and context kind of being laid out, it makes it far more clear as to who is really capable of these types of numbers. Guys like Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, of course, Joe Mixon, Dalvin Cook, their top tier running backs, Alvin Kamara's, Ezekiel Elliott's, have done this in the past. Christian McCaffrey has accomplished this in the past. There's a reason why I mentioned majority of those players in my top 12 running back rankings video yesterday, because I know that they're capable of accomplishing this level of production. And if they're able to do so, then they're worth my first round pick. Because once I'm able to secure one and maybe even get a second, that can lead me to a lot of success, avoiding that dead zone at the running back position between rounds 4 through 7, and potentially building a roster that is going to overall find far more success. Now, with this all mentioned, let's move on and away from the running back position. Let's talk about tight ends. Should I draft an early tight end in fantasy football? I heard this a plethora of times this offseason via DM on our community Discord server. This has all been mentioned to me. I wanted to go ahead, present some stats in regards to this, and kind of give you some context as to how I feel about the tight end position going into 2022. First and foremost, I think Travis Kelce deserves to be a late first, early second round selection. I think Mark Andrews should never get out of the second round either. Both of those guys have very high upside going into 2022, considering we saw Tyreek Hill leave the Kansas City Chiefs offense and Marquise Brown get traded away as well to the Arizona Cardinals, leaving Mark Andrews there by himself. Of course, Rashad Bateman's going to have to pick up some of that slack, but there's a lot of opportunities, available via targets to both these guys. With that mentioned, let's talk about, the tight end position as a whole. We all know that the tight end position has been one of the most volatile over the last 5 years. The heyday of the position is far past us. I mean, we were lucky in the past to get 12 stud tight ends every year. We are no longer in a position where we're going to see that. I mean, over the last 5 seasons, it has been a struggle to find a good tight end if you don't select one early. And the reason why I mention this is because, oftentimes we can find a hidden gem here and there. Let's talk about last year. Dalton Schultz was a stud. Dawson Knox was a stud the year prior to that. Robert Tonyan, Logan Thomas came out of nowhere. The year prior to that, Darren Waller, Mark Andrews. The year prior to that, George Kittle and Austin Hooper. We can get at least 2 tight ends a year that are going to be top 12 guys that come out of absolutely nowhere. We can find that level of production. But 2 out of 12 doesn't always guarantee that we're going to end up getting them off the waiver wire and they're going to be on our team and they're going to help us win. It's not a guarantee that those things happen, but we've seen it over the last couple of years. That being said, the tight end position has been a joke. In the last couple of years now, we have seen kickers and defenses outproduce tight ends on a yearly basis. In fact, last season, there were only 4 tight ends that produced more than 150 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. Only 4 tight ends. In the same vein, we saw 9 kickers produce more than 150 fantasy points, and 5 team defenses produce more than 150 fantasy points. So, Andrew, what is the pure difference between drafting an early kicker and drafting an early tight end? Why the heck would I even invest in an early tight end if I'm not going to get, 180 points and kind of take advantage of that positional distribution? Well, you pose a great question there. Because when we look at the drop-off in production after the first couple tight ends on screen, there is a steep decline. I mean, the difference between the number 5 overall tight end over the last 5 seasons on average and the number 15 is getting to the point of where it's a 50-point drop-off. We never want to be drafting that number 15 guy. We don't want to start him on a weekly basis. We want to get into a position where we have a stud tight end, or at least someone that is serviceable enough to get us in that 9 to 10 point range every single week. 150 points, I'll take it. I'll take the number 5 tight end every single season because at least they'll help me win more often than some of these guys that are putting up dud performances of 6.5 points in a given week, ending up pretty much losing you multiple contests. So with this all mentioned, I'm 100% bought in on the idea that you should, if given the opportunity and are in the specific range of the late first round, drafting Travis Kelce, great. Middle of the second round, I don't mind going Mark Andrews as long as it doesn't impede my approach of getting 2 running backs in my first 3 picks. Going RB, tight end RB is perfectly fine by me. I think you can find a lot of success in doing that going into 2022. So go ahead, give it a shot, see what you find. If in fact you are in a draft where you potentially don't end up selecting an early tight end, again, there's no problem with waiting until the later rounds, 10th, 11th round, picking a tight end, Hunter Henry, David Njoku, trying to grab this year's kind of, number 10 to 12 range tight end and pairing them up with a guy that you can pick up off the waivers later on. But in terms of early drafting of a tight end position from between rounds 1 through 4, I'm all in on drafting a stud tight end and making sure that my roster is ready to go henceforth. Now let's go ahead and let's transition to the next conversation regarding the quarterback position. Should we draft an early quarterback, or specifically, should we draft Josh Allen? I mean, Josh Allen should be the first quarterback off of every draft board this season. He's been the number 1 overall quarterback in back-to-back years in a standard quarterback scoring format. So, should it be a surprise that Josh Allen is taken in the 3rd round? No. Josh Allen is going to put up so many points. And like I've mentioned, the drop-off in production, not only at these other positions, is extreme. At the quarterback position, it gets crazy. The difference between the number 1 overall quarterback in the last 5 seasons in comparison to the number 12 overall quarterback is over 120 fantasy points. There is a ginormous drop-off, and that's why a lot of people, including myself, prioritize early quarterbacks. I am perfectly fine getting a quarterback in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round. Even the 8th round, if I can grab a stud, I'm perfectly fine there. But I don't want my starting quarterback in a 1 QB league to be Derek Carr or Kirk Cousins. They're going to be fine this year. They'll score 300 fantasy points. But I'd much rather have Jalen Hurts have that level of a drop-off in production where a guy is going to be outright winning me more weeks than Kirk Cousins is on a weekly basis. And I don't think the player that I would draft in comparison to that lower tier quarterback 1 conversation is going to make that much of a difference in terms of overall fantasy contribution in a given season. I'll go ahead and kind of put this into more context by showing you some draft samples next, but just wanted to go ahead and state it. If in fact Josh Allen is available at the end of the 3rd round, I would potentially take him depending on how many running backs have been grabbed. If the top 16 running backs are gone, and there isn't someone there that I'm 100% confident in, maybe I'll change up my strategy. Maybe I'll grab a quarterback. But typically, I want 2 running backs within my first 3 rounds. I don't mind starting running back, wide receiver, running back, and then taking Josh Allen in the 4th. But typically, from my experience, he doesn't last to that point. And if you want Josh Allen, you have to grab him in that middle of the 3rd round in order to, plant the flag and ensure that you have the top quarterback going into 2022. Now, the final thing I wanted to mention on today's video is, of course, showing how I have purely executed this draft strategy this off season. Obviously, I've drafted via Underdog Fantasy. Again, check them out. Link in the description. Use promo code Andrew today. Draft via Best Ball Mania 3 or the multitude of other contests, whether it's the Puppy, the Pomeranian, $5, $3 entries for those of you who are looking to get interested in that. Use promo code Andrew today. And of course, Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. Thank you very much. All right. So let's talk about some of these drafts that, I've kind of participated in as of late. I think this was about a week ago where I drafted Cooper Kupp as my first overall pick, 3rd overall in the draft. So I had the number 3 overall pick in the first round. I took Cooper Kupp. Really isn't a surprise considering Jonathan Taylor and Christian McCaffrey went. But I wanted to go ahead and test this strategy. Let's say, for example, you don't draft a running back in the 1st and you want to go wide receiver. I think that's perfectly fine. As long as you understand where that 3rd round pick is and what running backs are going to be available, that decision has to be made consciously knowing that your 3rd round running back may not be the guy that you want. You may get to the 3rd round and the best available running back at that point is Ezekiel Elliott, Javonte Williams. And that's not as good as Nick Chubb. But you have to understand where you're selecting and what you can potentially expect other teams to select by the time you get there. But nonetheless, I took Cooper Kupp in my 1st. I continued with my draft strategy of taking a running back in my 2nd and a running back in my 3rd, 2 out of the first 3 rounds, solidifying running back with 2, in my opinion, top 12 guys, the best receiver in the league, then following up with my 4th round selection of George Kittle. In this respective draft, Josh Allen, obviously already gone. And when I looked at the other running backs that were available, not interested, the other wide receivers that are available, it was at a point where I can maybe take a Terry McLaurin, but I'm not too interested in that. I'd rather get an advantage at the tight end position. Took Kittle in the 4th and followed that up with Allen Robinson in the 5th. You're going to see a lot of Allen Robinson in these drafts. It'll kind of give you an indication as to how much I like him this season. If I'm not mistaken, in this draft, I also paired up Cooper Kupp and Allen Robinson with Matthew Stafford. Kind of went late with the quarterback in that draft. But just to give you some draft construction early in your rounds, starting wide receivers perfectly fine as long as you get 2 running backs in the 2nd and 3rd rounds. Let's go to this next draft where I was selecting at the number 9 overall position. I started with Derrick Henry, followed up with Joe Mixon. I mean, those are 2 guys in my top 7 running backs going into 2022.5 PPR. Then we follow that up with Michael Pittman Jr. and Allen Robinson. I'll take Jalen Hurts in the 5th, and I'll secure Dalton Schultz in my 6th round. Now, the reason why I'm comfortable taking a tight end in the 6th is because I think Dalton Schultz is far more undervalued than people give him credit for. There's going to be a lot less target competition early in the season with no Amari Cooper, no Michael Gallup. They might end up limiting some of Zeke's snaps because of course, he's slowing down. But Dalton Schultz is going to be a huge part of that offense. I think he'll outproduce his current ADP and where I selected him. But either way, another way to construct the roster. 2 running backs early. Get yourself a wide receiver 1 in Michael Pittman. Follow up with a solid wide receiver 2 with Allen Robinson. Grab a stud top 5 quarterback, a top 5 tight end, and you're off and away. Let's move on. Couple more draft samples. We move on where I had the number 1 overall selection. Of course, you want to start that with Jonathan Taylor. You follow that up in the 2nd round, selecting Leonard Fournette, number 24 overall. And then again, I'm building on grabbing wide receivers. I took my wide receiver 1 in Michael Pittman. The draft came back to me. In the 4th and 5th, I took Allen Robinson and Rashad Bateman, solidifying my wide receivers and avoiding the running back dead zone. I then selected Joe Burrow in the 6th round, then started to dabble back into the running back position because once that dead zone disappears, there are a couple guys that I'm willing to take risky selections on. A.J. Dillon, and then 20 plus picks later, Rashad Penny at pick 96 overall. Dude, I'll take that. I will take that any single day because A.J. Dillon is one injury away from being a top 5 running back. If Aaron Jones goes down, we've seen it. He's got the potential of not only being a flex player, but being a top 5 running back if something is to go, unfortunately wrong with Aaron Jones. And then we got Rashad Penny, who of course has upside, but also some inherent risk in him. And then we took a tight end super late here with Zach Ertz in the, the 9th round. Nonetheless, let's talk about the next draft that I participated in. Started double running backs from the number 8 overall position. Taking Austin Eckler, followed with Saquon Barkley, and then I locked up a bunch of stud wide receivers, taking Keenan Allen, Gabriel Davis, DK Metcalf, followed with Schultz in the 6th round, which I like to do a lot, Michael Thomas the following selection, then went and grabbed my quarterback of Trey Lance. What you'll continue to see in my draft strategy, based on these samples, is that I like to take 2 running backs in my first 3 rounds. I want to get a stud quarterback, and I want to get a tight end that I am personally comfortable with. The guy that I like to go after, obviously based on the distributions here, Dalton Schultz at the tight end position, solid wide receiver of Allen Robinson, but that's typically what I want to do. I mean, I'm 100% open to the idea of taking Kelsey, of taking, Andrews, but it has to be at a right point. It has to be at a position where the running back position hasn't been impacted too much. If I take a tight end, I'm not going to be punished, or my 3rd running back overall is going to be a dud. Think about it. If I'm at the back end of the 1st round, I'm at the 12th overall pick, and let's say, for example, I can pair together, let's say, DeAndre Swift and Travis Kelce. Those are 2 fantastic first and 2nd overall selections. By the time the draft comes back to me in the 3rd round, the best available running back is not going to be one of those top 16 guys that I'm referring to. It could end up being a guy that you're not so confident in. You don't know whether or not that respective player is going to be able to produce the high level production that you need your running backs to produce, which could end up throwing your draft off a little bit. But again, where you select often matters, and the strategy in which you approach it will certainly impact the production of that given team. Nonetheless, hopefully this kind of gives you some examples and the overall draft strategy that I like to implement in my leagues. If this helped you out, be sure to go down in the comment section. Let me know exactly what kind of draft strategies you guys like to use. Let me know if you think this is something you want to go ahead and try. If you do, check out Underdog Fantasy. Again, link is down in the description. Use promo code Andrew today. Hopefully all of the statistics and the information I gave you regarding drop-off in production, workhorse running backs, the running back dead zone, the studs at the tight end position, and why we want to prioritize them. Hopefully all of that information guides you towards an early round draft strategy that can build a successful team. Of course, take advantage of it today. Use promo code Andrew via Underdog Fantasy, and Underdog Fantasy is willing to match up to $100 of your first deposit. You can build teams like this and potentially prepare yourself for your home league drafts, so you'll be far more comfortable regardless of where you're selecting at, building teams that are with 2 running backs within the first 3 rounds, whether it is wide receiver in the 1st, wide receiver in the 3rd, tight end in the 1st or 2nd, it doesn't matter. You can find success either way with this kind of a draft strategy. If today's video helped in any regard, be sure to also click the like button down below. And of course, subscribe if you have not yet already. We're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2022 season. Tomorrow, I will be doing a live draft via Underdog Fantasy, so be sure to tune in for that. Should be very exciting. I'll give you the per round analysis for every selection and give you an even greater understanding as to how I approach my drafts. Until next time, everybody, thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you. Peace.